Hello, welcome to the Always Andy's Mom podcast. I was just going to say what episode number it was, and now I kind of forgot. So I have to look and see which episode number this is.
Okay,
Oh my gosh, this is
150.
episode 155.
Oh, I was gonna say 9. I was wrong.
No, you're 155. So this is episode
Okay.
155 of the Always Andy's Mom podcast. And I'm your host, Marcy Larson, here with the wonderful Gwen Capsha from Your Grief Guide. And we are here to tackle the subject of men and grief.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about it in different contexts, right? We've talked about relationship, like couples relationships, and grief. We've talked about grieving as a family, so husbands and wives and their kids and things like that. But we haven't kind of teased out just men in general, because I do get a lot of questions on that, actually. Whether it's I don't understand my husband, I don't understand my ex-husband, I don't understand, my teenage son, all of those things I get from moms. And then from dads, I have found it interesting that sometimes they feel like, is my grief really normal? Because this doesn't seem like how it maybe should be. Right? And how they feel like grief should look like. It feels different to them, and they'll get worried that maybe I'm not doing it right. Not that you can do grief right or wrong exactly, but I think they question that, right?
Well, I think when they're living with females, especially because we are so different, they can tend to maybe think that they're not doing it right.
Right. Or maybe people will actually kind of give that idea, right? Those women in their lives may give them the idea that you aren't doing this right.
Yeah. I was just digging while you were talking, because I remember thinking about things that make men cry, and if they had men rank them, what makes them cry.
Yeah.
And then the other part is the top most 15 important numbers to men, like their age or children's age, how much they earn each year, what it costs to be alive, how much they earn per hour, those kinds of things.
Yes.
It's just interesting, because no matter what you do, whether you rank, emotional reasons to cry or numbers that are important to men, they are going to answer different than women.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't tell you. I don't know that I've ever been to a wedding that I haven't had a tear. Right. And every time my husband looks at me and says, "It's not a funeral." Like, why are you crying?
Right.
Doesn't get it. Not at all.
Well, and I just have to say, for my husband, he cries at sports movies. Sports movies get him, Rudy and all those sports movies. And we can watch a sports movie and I can look at him and think, you're crying? I mean, it's a football movie, right? It's a baseball movie. And maybe it's kind of emotional, but it doesn't get me tearing up. And yet we can watch something else that is really I'm almost sobbing. And then I got nothing from him, So it's totally, totally different.
Right. What touches their little spot.
Yeah.
Well, one of my questions to start with that I was thinking for you, I know you're the one who normally asks the questions, but I was just curious and thinking of your listeners and people who have listened long term. You have interviewed men.
Yeah.
And you said, you get comments, you get these things from men. Has it felt different to interview men? Has it been harder, awkward? What does that feel like?
It doesn't feel awkward at all. I love it when men want to be on the show. I mean, they're usually pretty excited to be on, right? I mean, I don't usually have to kind of beg somebody to be on. It is funny because most of the men that I've had on are doing something, right? So that's a difference. So most of the women, or not most, but many of the women I have on are just wanting to tell their child's story, right? But a lot of the men I have on have maybe written a book, or they've started a podcast, or they're thinking about doing something. Not all of them, at all. But I do think more of them, and it's maybe that has to do with how they process their grief a little bit,
Mhm,
that they're
mhm.
a little bit more of a doer kind of person.
Right,
I recently had one that, has started a TV show. And so
right.
and now he was on with his wife, so they do it together. But again, he's like the producer sort of the TV show. So it was something that he could do with his
Mhm.
grief, I think, you
Right.
know?
Well, that's interesting that you say that because what we know is like men tend to be very logical, and the steps of being logical say, I'm going to study about it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to check the boxes, and then I'll be done. And so there's like a progression through, and they have that. So in a sense, it if checking the box means I'm going to do something with this, and I want to
Hmm.
do that,
Yeah.
I can see why that would be. And I have a story I'll tell you in a little bit, but, it will come back to that about the doing part.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
For
That's
sure.
just what I think back because I'm thinking through all of these guests that I've had on, and I've had, two
Mhm,
podcasters and two or three writers.
mhm.
And I mean, it does
Yeah,
tend to be that
right,
they've done some sort of project or something.
right. Well, and that I've said this before on here, but intuitive grieving is more what women do, and instrumental grieving is more of a man's thing, and that has more steps. It has, "What can I do with this?" And, they like that. "Tell me what
Yeah.
to do," and
And
mhm.
and I think that depends a lot on personality too,
Yes,
because
I do
I
too. There
mean,
are women who are instrumental as well.
I mean, I'm sort of like that. I really
Mhm.
wanted, I mean, what I called you. How soon after Andy died did I call you?
Within
Like
days.
within days,
Mhm,
right? I got your
mhm,
name from the funeral director, and I'm like in on the phone with you because I felt like I needed something to do. I'm kind of a
mhm,
doer kind of person, and I felt like you just need to tell me to what to do, and I will do it because I felt like as at a loss to
mhm.
not do something,
Right,
right? I need
and
to be
look at
doing
you.
something.
Look
Well,
at you.
now,
You are
yeah.
doing that, but
Well, now I
so that
am, right.
didn't yeah, but that didn't stop. You started at the beginning, needed to be a doer, and even in your healing and starting this, you're still a doer.
Yeah. And right, and
Mhm.
different people have different ways of handling it.
Right.
So,
And that is the hardest part. So in the fact that we are different, um, well, I was thinking of something. Someone was telling me that they related grief to like a Rubik's cube, and I forget. I think it's Northwestern University. I wrote it down over here because I just read this. Yeah, Northwestern University. There's two engineers who, with a Rubik's cube, can put it all back together in just 26 moves, and they were relating grief to that. Like, life might start out with all the sides matching, and then grief. But what is the normal amount of moves to get back? And they said, other than these two engineers, if you take a 4 and a 3, put 18 zeros behind it, that's how many moves it can take to get back.
yeah.
43, I don't know how many 18 zeros is,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because, um,
Well, and it
different
doesn't feel like then you'll
personalities.
ever get back, right? And
Right,
I don't
and you
I don't
don't
know that I
really.
ever
Yeah,
will. Yeah, I mean,
exactly. But I'm relating it to the fact that some people that's really like, if you think of a task-oriented person, is needing to figure out, "How am I gonna do this?" Where others may
right.
just feel it and let it happen.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But if you right, I like that. So you feel
Mhm.
like you're thinking about this is a puzzle to solve,
Right. Pieces to place together, and if
pieces,
I do
right. So
this,
just
will that
tell
make
me
me
what to
feel
do.
better?
I'll go
Right,
through these 10 steps, and then maybe I'll be okay again,
right.
feeling
Yeah.
okay.
Well,
Mhm.
and, when things make us hurt, we tend to not wanna go there. And
Right.
again, it being a logical thinker for some people, if that hurts me, then I'm not gonna think about it. So, they maybe avoid their grief because they're avoiding the pain, but to them, it's a logical thing because why would I wanna do that?
Right. And I think I get that a lot, right? That's one
Mhm.
thing that I think about from moms that write me that don't understand what's going on with their husbands. It's that.
Mm.
It's that they don't want to talk about it. They don't want
Mhm.
to do it. They don't want to go to a support group. They don't want to
Mhm.
do all of this kind of stuff, honestly, because it hurts and they would rather try to not feel it. I
Right.
think,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yes, that happens very frequently, and that leads me to, I was telling you that I went to a conference with the Compassionate Friends. Maybe some of
Mhm.
your listeners were there. They had their national conference at the beginning of August and in Houston, Texas. And I went to a lot of the workshops on men and grief because I'm doing a big seminar on it coming up. And so when you mentioned this, I'm like, okay, I got to start my studying. But
Yeah. Now this is
I
your prep.
right, right. So I went to one, and a man who
Ooh, I can't hear you, Gwen. I don't know what's going on, but I can't hear you. You are muted.
I am. I just got
You
a
were.
up in the corner that I was muted, and I don't know
Okay.
what happened.
You will have to start
So,
again. I don't know how that happened. All of a sudden it
okay.
looked like, oh, you're muted.
Yeah. So at the conference, I don't think what I'm going to share is private. That's what I'm trying to think about. Yeah, but I got to think this through what I'm going to say. But this man was a presenter, and he was talking
Right.
about men and grief. And basically, when you just said, the women are saying, I don't understand my husband. This is what he said: women beehive, men man cave.
Oh,
And if you
yeah.
think about that, we all wanna huddle together, and we, get in that, "Oh, we gotta figure this out," and there's a lot of chatter and and men just retreat and go into their cave.
Right.
Yeah. A couple of the
Right.
other differences he talked about is that with women, their emotions are more wide open, right? And the
Right.
feelings, you know, they feel their way through, so they're just oozing it out, where men tend to keep their cards closer to their chest, like, "I'm not gonna show my game." And they're probably way more protective over who they let into that inner
Mhm.
trust circle for sure.
Well, I even think back this week, it's very interesting that so Peter started school. He's a junior in
Mhm.
high school, and he started, and his first English project that he had to do was he was supposed to write a poem, and it was supposed to be about core memories that he had and kind of
Oh, boy.
who he was and taking into account these core memories. And so he was supposed to journal about a core memory and then write a poem about who he was as a person. Did not go well. I mean, we had the parent orient open house the night before, and I went in, and she said, "This is what the project was," and I thought, "Ooh, I don't know how he will
Mhm,
do." But
mhm,
overall, Peter doesn't talk to me much about his grief anymore. He's 4 years
mhm,
out. We don't talk about it that much, to be honest. And I've had people ask, "How's Peter?" And I'm like, "I think okay. I don't know," because he
mhm,
doesn't
mhm.
talk about it. But he, of course, was supposed to be journaling in English class, and he couldn't because he said every memory had Andy in it. And the biggest core memory was of the
Mhm,
car accident.
mhm, mhm,
And he just couldn't go there and do
mhm,
that. And so he emailed his teacher, I think from in the classroom, emailed his teacher, I can't do this. And a little bit. And then they talked about it afterwards, and they came up with a little bit of an alternative assignment that he's just supposed to talk about all recent memory and kind of a poem on something a little more recent, just because it just would have been too painful for him. And
mhm,
then she said, and he said, and so I got an email from her saying, he said he would talk to you about it when he got home, but I just wanted to write to you. And she apologized, which there was no need for her to apologize, right? There's no
mhm,
way that she would have known that. And anyway, I read this email. Peter had said nothing. He told her he was going to talk to us
mhm,
about it,
mhm,
but he didn't. So I
hmm,
went upstairs, and then we had to talk about it, and it was good. And he teared up, and we had a nice talk about it.
mhm,
So overall, I think it was a good thing because it really got us communicating a little
mhm,
bit again, um, about his emotions and his feelings and just how that's too much. And I loved that he problem solved. I loved that he got through that. I loved that he did all that with his teacher. But it just goes to show again that even though he said he was going to talk to us, he still
right,
didn't. Mhm.
right. And mom, you did a great thing by going up and having that conversation, because sometimes it's that first step that's so hard, because in his
Right.
heart he maybe really wanted to tell you that, but he didn't know how to bring that up.
Right, and I think that's it. I think he
Mhm.
had every intention of telling us
Right. Yeah.
when he said that to his teacher,
Mhm.
but it just, when it got right down to it, it was too hard, and he just
Mhm.
doesn't want to, right? He doesn't want to think
Mhm.
about that. It's painful again, and
Right.
he'd already been emotional earlier in the day. And so anyway,
Well, and let's talk about teenage sons since we
yeah,
said we would, it's a great segue into that, is that one of the things about teenagers in general is they just wanna be having fun. So, I
yeah,
mean, hey, I've started my junior year and I'm in this great, even if he likes or dislikes English, it's like, oh, great, I can write a poem about a memory. And then all of a sudden, it's not fun. It
no,
turns serious, it turns deep. And teenagers don't want to go there. They want to stay on the
no,
surface and just the next fun thing and that sort of thing. So that is normal
right.
for that, right? And he's probably looking around if he's got new students or new people, and he's probably saying, "Do I want to tell them my core memory?" It's not,
Right.
and
And this
yep,
was a thing too. When they finish this poem, they have to present it to the class, and they
that's
have
what
to
I was.
present it to the freshman class. And then the freshmen
Okay,
have to present their poems to the junior class.
right.
Like,
So for
that is
him,
not going to
yeah,
work, right? He's
no,
not
not at
going
all.
to. It it's like something, maybe he could present it to his own class, because some of them
Mhm.
likely know that he had a brother who
Right,
died, but he's not going to feel comfortable going on to the
right,
freshman class and doing
right,
that,
yeah.
right? And
And
being
I was
vulnerable and
wondering,
emotional.
how do you translate a tragic car accident into a poem? To me,
No, I
those
know.
don't line up. So
But he just felt like, what made him what he is today. And in many respects, that
yes,
did,
right,
right? That
very much
changed him
so.
forever.
Yes. And you know what? Someday he might write about it. It might, just it is part of his story,
He
but
hates writing. He's an engineer.
oh,
He's not going to
okay.
write if
All
he
right.
doesn't have
Yeah.
to. But
That says a lot right there. One of the things I was going to share with you, thinking of teenage sons, is again, I have a friend who raised 3 boys, and her youngest is going to be 21 next week or so. So this past weekend, she wanted to spend some time with him, and they went out to lunch. And she said, face to face in a restaurant, we had great conversations and no complaints, just a lovely time. But on the way home, there was something going on in Grand Rapids with the traffic, and they were stuck for a long time in traffic. So they're looking forward, and all of a sudden, he started to share feelings. And she
really,
was reminded back that when we are talking to men and boys, that face to face interaction is just too hard. So, at the lunch table, that was too threatening. And he kind of shut down some of those things. But when they were in the car, both facing forward, then he could talk about some of those things that were a little more
so
serious or heartfelt.
not making eye contact is almost better.
It
Is that what you're
is.
saying?
Yes, with a boy, they say, and even with our husbands, that we're supposed to be doing an activity sometimes when we talk about stuff. It's not a let's sit in a circle and share, which leads you back to something that your listeners have asked you is my husband doesn't want to go to a group.
Yeah.
So if you
Hmm.
think of the beehive and a woman who keeps her emotions out versus a man who man caves and keeps his cards close to his chest, it's probably not going to want to go to a group where
Right.
women go to more support groups and classes. So that's normal.
Okay.
Yep,
Okay.
very much so.
It's
Um,
hard though if you're wanting to go to some sort of family thing, then,
mhm,
and not,
mhm,
maybe you want to go to a family retreat, and now
mhm.
dad doesn't want to go. And so do you go with the kids by yourself?
Right. We
It
had
makes
that a
it
lot
very
at
challenging.
yep, and at Starlight, the groups, the mom would say, "I don't know if my husband will come," and just encouraging them to come without them and to do
Yeah.
that kind of thing. I think because the next thing about men is they tend to do want to problem solve. So I think they'll give anything a try for a little bit just because they probably go under the umbrella of if it's going to make it better, I guess
Yeah.
I'll
Well,
go
that's true.
and
Then
I'll
maybe you'll
try
try
it.
it.
Right.
Hmm.
But women might want to stay in the group longer or form connections within the group that maybe the men don't necessarily.
Well, and I think back to us going to Starlight too. The first week, I didn't do great, to be honest. I was sitting there just like kind of in the back of my mind, I was just screaming, "You don't belong here. You don't belong here. You are
Mhm.
not one of these people." Right? I didn't want to
Mhm.
be
Mhm.
one of those people. Um, and the kids didn't do awesome either. But we
Mhm.
left and Eric felt better. He's like,
Mhm.
"That was great. We really need to go back." And I was
Yeah.
like, "Okay," because I was like, Gwen was good, but
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Mhm.
It was just so hard, and I didn't know if I would really be able to do it. And the next week, I actually like ran out into the hallway halfway through and
Mhm.
kind of had a meltdown, and before I went back in
Mhm.
again. So, it's it was hard, but
Right.
yet Eric was the one like, "Yep, we're going back next week." And
Mhm.
I looked at the kids and I was like, "Okay, your dad liked it, so we're going
Right.
back."
Well, the other thing is it probably gave him information on
Yeah.
listening to others and, oh, okay, he's probably gauging his family next to the information that he was getting. Again, problem solving it. But once
Yeah.
Eric figured it all out, now you still have those emotional connections and you're still connected to the women, but I don't know that he's connected to any man there.
Well,
I'm
and
not
you
going to
know what
presume.
was funny too with him is everybody like the second week at Starlight, everybody tells their
Yeah.
story, their grief story.
Mhm.
And so they went around telling grief stories and super emotional. That's the one I
Mhm.
like kind of.
Yeah.
It was hard.
Mhm.
And Eric laughed like he felt better because he felt like he was lucky because he wasn't the other people and their stories.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right? So it made him feel a little better about his grief. Like, wow, Andy was totally healthy kid up until the car accident when
Mhm.
he died. We didn't have to watch him suffer. We didn't have to
Mhm.
do this. We didn't, it was all of those type of things like, aren't you glad that you didn't have to watch it? And then I
Well,
was just like spent and
yeah, and here I am gonna say this, engage logical brain. He was
right,
totally engaged in his logical brain going, "Oh, that story fits here on my scale. This story fits here," and
right.
that's the way he processed that. Yeah.
Well, and it just made him feel like better. And in some ways, I
Mhm.
would say the same, right? That I would listen to those other stories and like, oh, I'm so glad that I didn't have to do that.
Mhm.
But I just was much more on the emotional aspect of it. And I think he was looking at it more logically.
Yeah.
It's his engineering,
Right,
engineering
right.
brain a little bit, right?
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And, one of the things that this man said in this seminar for himself being a man cave
Yeah.
was that that was a safe place for him, that
Hmm.
retreating into his space. And I think in his house, his man cave was his basement, like a lower level with the big TV and cushy furniture, whatever. It can look different for other men. I mean, it can be an ice
Hmm.
fishing shanty or a deer blind or who knows what it is. But he said that's where he felt he could heal spiritually, heal physically, and heal emotionally. So his healing, he felt, happened in his private space,
And in
not in a
solitude,
public space.
right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Which I think most women would probably say they don't feel like their grief does heal in solitude. Mine
No.
does not. If I am
Right.
all by myself, it is bad, right? I
Mhm.
am in a bad
Mhm.
place if people leave me alone too much. I
Right.
need someone to engage me because otherwise I will start to wallow and get deeper and deeper and deeper.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
it's hard for me to, I think, understand that for some people, solitude actually will make them feel better.
Right. Right. Yeah,
Wow.
it's
Mhm.
just in that processing, but he also used the word autopilot a lot, and his, daughter died as a college student in a car accident, and he was away on business. He was also going
Mhm.
through a divorce, so we're gonna talk about ex-husbands and where they fit because
Yeah.
he wasn't sure where he fit in relationship to making decisions and with his wife and, soon to be
Yeah.
ex-wife, and there was just so many complications, but he said that in making the arrangements to get home and trying to figure this all out, it was very much an autopilot kind of thing. So he was really functioning on the tasks and not the feeling. And he was just going
Mhm.
through, where he could walk through an airport and just be on that, I got to get home. Where if a woman was out of town and found out a child died, I bet everyone on the airplane would hear her story. Wouldn't you think?
I
Maybe.
I don't know. I mean,
I
I've
mean, I
heard.
can think back. Yeah, I can think.
I've been on with people who found out and had to fly home, and there's a lot of crying. Yeah, I mean,
Yep. I can
But
think of one woman who found out while she was away from home that her child had died, and she was in a shopping center parking lot and trying to drive home, and just pulled over her car and got out and just started sobbing in the parking lot of the shopping center. People were coming up and asking her what was wrong, and she's like, and thankfully, I think someone offered to drive her home.
mhm, mhm.
But anyway, he talked a lot about that autopilot and that he just could focus on the tasks that had to be done,
Yeah,
where I think I've watched, other people just say, I couldn't even think of anything that had to be done. I had to have someone tell me, now you need
yeah,
to do this, now
yeah.
you need to do that. So
Mhm.
again, that's another way that maybe the operation's different.
Well,
um
and then back to the whole thing that I talked about with not knowing if you're a man feeling like, am I doing something wrong? I mean, I think back
mhm,
to Eric that, we're in the back of the ambulance and that paramedic said that Andy had died, despite our
mhm,
best efforts, we were unable to save her son. Those were his exact words. And I immediately started crying and Eric didn't.
mhm,
He didn't. And he really judged himself over it quite badly.
mhm, mhm,
I mean, he told me, I remember thinking to myself, "What is wrong with you? Why
mhm,
aren't you crying? Your son is dead." Right? And he's just been the one doing CPR on him and trying to revive him and doing all that stuff. And again, that's into that action mode, right? And
mhm,
that's his
mhm.
doctor role,
Right,
obviously, that
yeah.
he was doing. But after it was gone, it took him hours before he cried at all.
Mhm.
He didn't cry
Well,
at all.
this man addressed this in the seminar. So I took my notes. So I came home today from what I was doing all day to investigate whether this was true. So put on your physician hat, because he
Okay.
said, why don't men cry as much as women? He said testosterone. And he said, so I started looking it up, and testosterone can inhibit crying. Well, there's a hormone called prolactive. Yeah,
Prolactin.
yeah, prolactin. Yeah.
Yeah.
It says it can promote it, and women have more of that than men. So
It's
right
what causes you
there.
to lactate, actually. That's why it's
Oh, that's why it's called.
prolactin.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah, so when you're breastfeeding, you have very high levels, but yeah,
And are
prolactin.
women more emotional while breastfeeding? I was not a breastfeeder, so I don't know.
Well, I think they're more emotional while they're pregnant and
Yeah,
their prolactin's higher then, and,
right.
perhaps when they're breastfeeding, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Okay.
But anyway, just to know what the
Okay.
name of that hormone
So,
definitely would have
yes,
come from that.
no.
Mhm.
So he was saying, we're made different on our hormones. So he said, um, if we have more testosterone, it actually gives a male a more cognitive approach, and it keeps you calmer. So then I looked up, does testosterone keep you calmer? And it said that men have half the reported anxiety disorders as women, and that could be the role of testosterone. I did not know that men have half of the reported anxiety disorders of women. And so I'm like, wow, are these things true? So I didn't have enough time this evening, but I'm going to research this a little bit more. But he just basically said that men produce 30% more than women of
Mhm.
testosterone. But then it's
Yep.
interesting. He said it starts deteriorating and changing at age 30 for men.
Mhm.
So, because I have watched and I've often wondered, why are some of the older men I work with whose, wives have died much more tearful than the men who I work with who are young, who may have a wife or a child die. So I wondered
That
that.
is that is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It also may be why the teenage boys don't much at all,
Right.
right?
Because they have high levels. Yeah.
Very high levels, yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
So he said, guys, that's why we don't. We're chemically made differently. So, again, I'm listening to a layperson who's not a medical person give these things out. When you go to a conference, you write them down, and now it's my job to go in before I,
Well, I mean, it does make some sense, certainly.
Yeah. Um,
Especially when I think about as men age, they do tend to end up getting more emotional, and obviously their testosterone levels drop off quite a bit
right.
too. So,
Right. So here's what he said were 4 reasons to cry. He said it does detox your body. So he's like
mhm.
trying to encourage the men who were in there about crying. And that is so true that it does detox us. And but it led me back to what you just said about Eric. And that moment he was calmer. Didn't
Yeah.
mean that he wasn't going to cry about what happened. It's just at that moment he had an ability to be calmer, more
Mhm,
calm
mhm.
than you were. Um, so he just talked about the fact that it does detox your body, it improves your mood, and crying does do that. I mean, when you have that buildup where you need to have a good cry,
Yeah,
you get kind of ornery.
yeah.
Yeah,
And then you do feel better. It's funny because you avoid it and avoid
yeah,
it and avoid it. I mean, a lot of people do.
hmm,
Like, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. But a
right.
lot of times when you do, it's like, okay, I'm feeling a little better
Yeah.
now. I just got it out, right?
Right. And then he talked about the fact that it does restore your emotions. And what we mean by that is actually it is healthier because that myth is that if you ignore it or stay away from it, you actually feel better. And that's not true. So when, we can cleanse ourselves and talk about our feelings and our hurts, it actually does restore more positive emotions.
I think it can give your body a little bit of a reset.
Right. Very
Mhm,
much so.
mhm.
So if it's against their norm to cry out to cry, I mean, sometimes it might be helpful for a man who is sitting there going, "Wait, I don't think that's a good thing for me to do." That there are
Yeah.
benefits to it
Mhm,
when they
mhm.
feel. And then he just talks about the fact that it does dull the pain. Um, but he also addressed then the roles in relationships is that that's the other part is that so many times when something happens in a family, we go into our role,
Yeah,
so this is what we do. And sadly enough, men have been trained and taught to be the sustainers.
yeah. Mhm,
That,
mhm.
you keep the family together. You're supposed to protect them. This was,
The societal expectation sort of,
yes,
yeah. Mhm,
exactly, very
mhm.
much so. Um, so I think just to be aware of that and the differences, and again, I think for men, if they don't have maybe the number of relationships that women have, but I've watched many men have some deep relationships with other men that they can trust and tell their stuff to. I
Mhm.
think the other thing that happens in a relationship, a husband and wife relationship, is that many times that's the person you tell all your stuff to.
Yeah,
But when your wife's broken and hurting, then they feel like they've kind of lost her a little bit.
right, and I think you feel like you can't put more on
Right. Like,
her.
oh, if I tell her my stuff. Yeah.
Right, and I think then they end up feeling this, like, I have to be that for her, but I can't let her have to be that for me,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
I can be the
Yeah.
support for my wife, but gosh, she's
Mhm.
doing handling too much. We can't.
Yeah.
But we're stronger
Um
than you think we are. We
Right.
just showed it a little more, right?
We are, exactly. Well, I always go back to someone sharing with me, in Proverbs 31 where, they describe a woman, it compares her to rubies, and rubies are the second strongest stone there is. So, I mean, right there, we're compared to strength, even though you might not look at a woman as maybe being as strong. We are strong.
Mhm,
Mhm.
mhm.
Um, but I do wanna go back to something that I was saying about this man's relationship that he was the soon to be ex-husband
Yeah.
and, not living at home. I've also met people who are grieving a child that they had with their former spouse, and now they're married
Yes,
to a new spouse, and that
yes.
person's not grieving in the same way that they are.
Yeah, that's gotta
Mhm.
be hard.
Very much so.
Mhm.
Very much so, because again, that first wife, the mother of the child, may be the person who understands the most, but that's not a relationship that's maybe there anymore, at that same
Right.
level. So,
Mhm.
um, I have heard that that's hard because that's the other places they don't know where to go to grieve.
Mhm.
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 Yeah. In everything I've read today and other days, it is one of the temptations for men to stuff it, but then there's also a temptation to use drugs or alcohol. And I'm not saying they have a greater chance, but they just maybe tend to look for other coping mechanisms instead of feeling that pain. So I think for any man listening, just to kind of watch for that. And
Mhm.
I don't ever quiz men like, how much are you drinking? But this is what I ask people. And I think as someone listening who might be concerned about a man in their life is to think, has their relationship with alcohol changed since the death?
Mhm.
And, they say if it becomes your mood regulator, then it is a problem. So if someone had 2 beers every night before their child died, and now they still have 2 beers every night, that's not a real change.
Yeah.
But if that does change and increase, then I do think we have to look at that and say, you know, what other ways can we?
Well, I have some friends who lost their son and have talked to both the husband and wife. I'm closer to
Mhm,
the wife, obviously, but I've talked with both of them, and I know the husband said to me he had known one other bereaved dad, and that
mm,
bereaved dad has not stopped drinking
mhm,
since his son or daughter died. And
yeah,
so that's all he knew. He just knew
mhm,
of one guy whose child
mhm,
died and he
mhm,
won't stop drinking.
mhm.
So, I mean, that's pretty scary.
It
If you're
is.
that guy,
Yeah,
that's your what you
mhm,
know, right? The
right,
only person. And that's the coping mechanism, which obviously is a terrible coping mechanism, which he doesn't
mhm,
want to do. And he's like, I'm sure he's trying to steer far, far away from that because he knows how horrible it was
mhm,
for his friend. But
right, and
that's pretty scary.
it is, and so besides the alcohol, the other thing to look into is a complete shutdown where they're
Yeah.
not, if they're going to their man cave and doing their work in private, that's fine. But if they're completely shutting down, we need to find a way that they can let that out.
So here's a question then. How do you know the difference? When
With
they're
shutting
going off
down
in
in
the
the man cave.
man cave, how do you
Mm,
know if they are shutting down completely or if they actually
right.
are doing some work?
Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna go with what my gut tells me, and if I
Okay.
was in a situation like that or someone was asking me, I would ask the man, "When you retreat, are
Yeah.
you thinking about it? Are you doing, your inner stuff? Is it just your way of getting it out?" And
Mhm.
if they say yes, then but if they
Yeah.
shut you down and go, "No, I'm not gonna talk about it. I'm not," then
Okay.
that's a shutdown when they can't even answer the questions. Like, you don't have to tell me what you do in that space, but does it make you feel better? Does it um,
Yeah.
okay, so I'm married to an outdoorsman, which is, a completely different breed altogether. Um, so one of the things that I do know in observing him for 35 years is he is better when he's in the woods or in a boat or, and when he goes periods of time that he's not, I can tell he gets grumpy and ornery. But I don't ask him, "What do you do in the woods?" Like, I don't ask.
Yeah.
I can just tell that when he comes back, he's better. So that's the
Mhm.
other thing that a woman can observe is when they've come back, if you can see the mood change or that they've regulated things, then
Okay. I like that.
hallelujah.
I
Then
like that.
then go to the woods. And there'd be times that I'd say to my husband, You haven't been in the woods in a while. I think you need to go." And, it's interesting because, we're Christ followers, we go to church, but I think where my husband sees God more than in the address of our church is
Mhm.
in nature,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, and I've talked to a lot of bereaved parents who feel like they feel their kids more in nature too,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Mhm. You
Oh,
feel
so
closer to
much
them.
so.
Mhm.
Yes, so much so. Yep.
Well, I go back to thinking of that story that you've told on the podcast more than
Oh,
once, the chopping wood story,
yes, yeah.
right? So
Mhm.
that's a good one too. Why
It
don't
is.
you can certainly share that
Right.
again because
Well,
there's
yeah,
certainly new
so,
listeners from the last time you told this story.
yep, male and female, husband and wife, child died, and the wife asked me to come to the house, said, my husband, he's just not talking. He's not, he's just, she thought, completely shut down. And but anyway, so I get to the house and she said, see, he's not even going to come in for our visit. He's staying outside. I said, okay. So as we were walking to where we were going to be seated, there was a big sliding glass door, and I looked out and he was chopping wood. And I said, wow, that is a huge pile of wood. And she said, that's all he's done since she died. And I said, wow, that's a lot of grief in your yard. And she didn't look at that physical, him out there chopping, as a grief response. So it might not look like sitting in the house crying with the grief person, but he's out there doing that. And once she could see that, and I think that's the other piece that, women, we have to take our emotional brain out of it and put a little bit more of our logic and observe them and watch for ways that don't look like our ways. Like, oh, that's how he's doing that. And we have to do the same thing in showing love, because, to us, maybe we grew up thinking that a man sends you flowers all the time. And then that's not the reality. But yet, I can't, beautiful expressions of love. Like I have an example that just comes to my mind is a woman whose husband, when she's gone at night, like she's out at a concert or he's going to bed before her, he lays on her side to have it warm. So when she comes in, her side's warm.
Oh.
And it's like, that's love. But it wasn't flowers, right? So we have to look at the behavior and look at some of that. And I think that's where we have to take off that it doesn't look like mine, therefore he's not doing it right.
Yeah. That's a great example, though, of thinking about things that they might be doing that you don't interpret as grief work, as grieving, and look at it in a different way.
For sure. And again, they don't react, they process and step back, and they want to think about it. And I've met a lot of my friends who that bothers them in a fight because they want to fight it out. We're more explosive women, we just, and the man wants to step back and think about it. And can I get back to you on that and process it? And they're like, no, I want to talk this out right now.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the other things that this man said that he did that I want to get to was, he said ways that he worked through this were, and we started with this, he said, to do something for someone else. Like he needed. So what he said is, he was very logical at the beginning. He did all the steps, and this is, checking the boxes and what had to be done. Then he said he stayed in bed for 10 days. After the funeral, after everything, he just stayed in bed for 10 days. Now, I was going to ask him, were you crying at that time? Were you sleeping? What was it like for you? But I never got a chance to ask him. He just said he stayed in bed for 10 days. But the ways that he realized that he needed to work through it is he needed to begin doing some things for others. So he did that. He said another way he worked through it was with his faith and hammering that out. And, we've said on here, we can't neglect our soul. But then the next thing for him is he felt like he needed to do something for the community.
Yeah. But again, that gets back to the doing something. Right.
But again, here's a man leading this seminar and he's telling men what helped him. I mean, what other response? I guess he's falling right into line with, But then one of the other pieces for him in particular was that forgiveness, that he was angry at the driver.
Sure.
And there was some things he was watching, the truck driver was watching a pornographic movie on the screen in his cab of his truck when the accident occurred. And just that forgiveness towards that man and how he had to work through that. And I do think that leads back to a man's response of wanting to protect his family or to seek justice and make sure someone pays a price. And for him, he really had to work through that.
Yeah. Well, and that can be different for different people too. Because I mean, as far as the car accident for us, Eric forgave her way earlier than I did. So.
Right.
I mean, it's not always that way.
And again, is that a logical, like, these are things I need to do because I know it's better for me, and they just do it without women, we need to.
Well, you know what he did is he immediately put himself in her shoes
Mm, mm,
because, she hit us. Her 14-year-old son was in the front seat. He witnessed this.
mhm,
He witnessed his mom rear-ending this family
mhm,
and killing
yeah,
somebody.
mhm,
And he immediately just went to that.
mhm,
And I just was much more emotional and that, yeah, but she gets to tuck her son into bed every night and I don't
mhm.
because she was stupid,
Right.
and made
Oh,
a stupid
yeah.
choice. So,
Exactly. So, 2 totally different ways, and I do think, that Eric fits in more what this guy was saying, like, he needed to do that.
yeah, and
I
that's
don't know.
but yeah, he wasn't like he wasn't angry really at all.
Mhm.
He would just
Yeah.
I get, but again, he was trying to think of it logically. And in his mind, I think the anger, it really wasn't going to do anything.
Right. Right.
So there was
But
no
see, it's
way for the anger to cause some sort of improvement in the situation. Then
mhm,
there was no point having it
right. But
in
how
his
many
mind.
times did you go when you come home and you tell your husband something, a little bit of drama or a story, and they look and they go, "So what? None of our business. How does this affect our family?" And you're like, "Aren't you enraged that she said that or did that? Can you see it?" Like, it's
Yeah.
they're just so they think differently. So he processed that and said, "What good's the anger gonna do? I'm gonna put myself in her shoes and let go with it." And we're still sitting there going, "But wait a minute, she changed
Yeah.
my family forever."
Yeah. Right.
So it's a difference, but I've said this when we talked about men before and families and all of that, that we don't want to end on, or focus all the time on all the differences because we have differences. There's no
Hmm.
doubt about it. We're made differently. We are different. We have different roles. We have different family history. We have, different stresses going on in life. We have so many things, but the commonalities
Yeah. Hmm.
are that we all hurt.
Yeah.
We all have feelings. We all have to figure out what to do with them. And, that need transcends gender. Like, that doesn't matter what gender you are or what your chemical makeup is. We have a need when our heart's broken and things happen to work through that.
Hmm.
And to cry and to care and to count our blessings and to count days of I've made it through a day, whatever you're counting.
Yeah.
We all have to do that.
I do want to read this comment. Brian wrote in, and I really love what he wrote here. So he said, my wife and I very much passed the grief baton. Right away,
Oh,
I broke and she made all the calls. Then she would break and I took the wheel. Now, after a year, we grieve together in some ways, and I crave silence to make things slow down enough to think. So that
oh,
was beautiful. And I do love that passing because he's right. I think even, I told you
mhm,
Eric didn't cry, right? In
mhm,
right away, but yet I was the person who had to make all the phone calls to our family. He couldn't do
mhm,
it.
mhm,
He
mhm,
couldn't do it at all. So, I called both of our pastors. I called our family friends. I called my brother. I called his sister. I mean, I had to do all of that because he couldn't. So, even though he wasn't like broken down emotionally crying, he also
mhm,
just, he was kind of frozen in a
mhm,
way.
mhm.
Mhm.
I
But I
love
love this. I
I do
like the whole
too.
thing. So I love the passing the baton back and forth. That was a beautiful
Well,
analogy. And then the now I crave silence to make things slow down enough to
yeah.
think.
Yeah, and so those are 2 separate points. I think the first
Right.
one is that partnership where you can say, "Hey, who's got the strength here today in this," right?
Right.
Who's got, what does this mean? And so we do that in a lot of different ways in relationships, and that's beautiful that they do that in their grief. And then now they're at a point where it's not maybe as heavy or as what's the word? Oozing raw. So
Right.
now they can, carry each other. But the other part of the silence, that just goes back to that retreating. And sometimes people need that in order just to have that space.
Mhm. That
Mhm.
retreating can be healthy and helpful,
Right.
even though other people who you love in your life
Mhm.
might not think it that same way.
Mhm.
It really is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Which brings me, I mean, this is a whole different topic, but it leads me to the fact that I've been doing a lot of presentations on the fact that we have so much input and so much screen time and so much doing, doing, doing that we are forgetting to have solitude and, silence where we can have everything else hushed so we can hear what's happening in our own heart. And
Mhm.
so that's what he's saying there is that gets him in touch with this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we
Mhm.
we definitely need to do that. I've never been to one, but I've heard amazing things about silent retreats.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of them? Where people go and
Yes.
they don't talk? And
I don't that would be so strange.
wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But I will tell you something happened to me 2 summers ago. We were watching, our friends' animals, and so, chickens and all sorts of things, and we had to water their plants, and they have a pool, and they said, "In exchange for taking care of our yard and our animals, feel free to hang at the pool." So, I don't really do animals. I'm not an animal lover, so if that brings me down in ranking to people, I'm really sorry, but, um, I'm not an animal lover, so I went there to their home and just told my husband I'd float in the pool till he got there to feed the animals, and he didn't show up, and he didn't show up, and they just have this quiet backyard. I didn't bring a book to read because I didn't think I was gonna be there by myself that long. I had no music. I don't even think I had my phone. I think that was part of it, like, to text him and say, "When are you coming?" And it was like 3 hours by myself in total
Mhm.
silence, but the creativity in my brain I was so excited about, and I keep thinking, "Why don't I do that at other times just to have that silence?"
Mhm.
Because I tend to fill myself with people and reading or what am I gonna do next, and so
Well,
I could take a
I
lesson.
shortly after Andy died, one of my friends took me to a place, I can't even remember what it was called, but it was like this, you went in this little room thing that you floated in salt water,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and it was in total darkness. Like you can't
Yes.
see anything. It's completely dark, and you just lay there and float
Yeah.
in this salt water. It
Did you
was
like it?
that I that it's a good question. It was very, very, very emotional for me to
That's what I've
be,
heard.
yeah, to be in so, I mean, there was no sensory input at all, right?
Mhm,
There's nothing.
mhm,
You're just
mhm,
laying there floating. You can't, I mean, you put your arms out to the side and you couldn't quite touch either side, right? So you're just
mhm, mhm.
floating. And I never, I don't know, it's
I've had
trying
people
to,
have different experience with it. 2 friends went, and one absolutely loved it, and one hated the feeling of it. Just
well,
hated
it
that.
just was, I mean, my friend took me to it because I was actively grieving because Andy hadn't been gone that long. But in some ways, I think it was a little early
Mhm,
for me to
mhm,
do that because it felt so big then. I mean, the grief was so incredibly overwhelming
mhm,
there, and
mhm,
I was at a point where I couldn't feel it all.
mhm.
It was just too hard to feel it all, right
Yeah.
away. You just can't feel it
No, you
all.
can't. No.
And it was just too much. It would be
Mhm,
interesting now, years later, what it might feel like now.
mhm.
I mean, I never went back because I think
Right,
it just scared me.
right.
Mhm,
Well, I had a friend go to a yoga class, and I forgive me that I don't know what type of yoga it was, but someone invited her, but it was some emotion, like to evoke emotion.
mhm.
And she wasn't prepared, and she really was uncomfortable with the whole thing. So I was thinking of that as you were talking, which led me to another point, is I think women, we have to read cues from the men in our life, especially teenage boys that, "Mom, it's too much."
Yeah.
We wanna stay till it's all finished and wrapped up with a nice little bow, and we feel perfect about it, and everyone's hugging and singing Kumbaya, right? but
Mhm.
they get to a point that it's too much. And so I think we have to take our clues from that. And I've watched it in support group where the women are just engaged in something and the men have already checked out. And I can tell the difference. And I've been a couple places where I've just said, men, if you need to leave, you can. We're going to just finish this up. And a couple of them get up, and it's holding it for too long or too much of it. They just need to retreat. And so I've observed that.
Well, and I did want to make one more point, maybe ask a question
Mhm.
about just friends that I've had whose teenage boys are not understanding their emotionality. So they are
Mhm.
getting frustrated with their mom over, they just want them to be mom
Yes. Yeah.
and to be happy and to be more normal.
Yep.
And how do you recommend responding to that?
Yeah.
Because they can't be.
Right. So I have so many thoughts, but it all boils down to communication and then the compromise. So the talking it out. What parts of what I cry make you uncomfortable? Does that evoke a fear in you that I'm not going to come back? I'm not going to be, but then the other part is to hear what their concerns are. And then one of the things we don't realize, I think oftentimes, I've seen this especially with bereaved moms, is how much they're wearing their grief out there, and it does infiltrate every part of the family. And the
Mhm.
child just wants maybe the fun mom or wants to be able to do something without that
Yeah.
heaviness of that grief. So we have to hear that. So hear me saying, I'm not saying the mom has to put all her grief aside and be happy. And I'm not saying that but I think we have to find the middle, especially when a child is expressing, I don't like who you are anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not the same, and this is who I am, but let me try when I'm around you. Or when we do have a family activity, that maybe to truly make that activity a fun activity and let the child choose it and what would be
Yeah,
good.
or right, and again, with you with a compromise, like, what would
Yes.
make things better? What could we maybe do this week?
Mhm.
Have one
Yep.
evening or something that we're going to do something
Yeah.
and see if you can do that as a compromise. But then the other way, they gotta give you a little something back
They do.
too,
And
right? They can't
that
now be whine and complain the other 6 nights of the week because you really went out of your
right,
way to do something. So
right.
that means you've gotta
Exactly.
have more patience too the other way.
Yes. And I read this thing recently or heard it that, um, resolving arguments or resolving anger, resolving conflict comes down to, are you and I together committed to
Mhm.
keep talking about this until we find a solution? And I realize that that's what I do with families, is that we need to keep talking about it, whether it's the holidays coming up, whether it's what to do with the pictures on the wall, or,
Mhm.
I've shared this story before in my grief things, but about the food with that young
Yeah.
boy who, was mad at his mom, um, because she was not cooking in her grief.
Mhm.
And, have I told this story on here
Yeah,
before? Yeah,
yeah, I
okay.
love the story though.
Yeah, um, but for them, it was, he was so angry at mom, but it came down to the fact that he just wanted the meals back because the brother had lived for 9 months in the hospital and they were with him all the time, so he was being fed by strangers. So when his brother actually died, what he wanted was his mom back. And she's thinking, "Are you crazy? Like, I lived through 9 months of your brother in critical care, and now I'm grieving, and you're worried about meatloaf?" I mean, like,
Yeah,
it could
right.
have divided the whole family because, as people fight over the color of carpet, and this family was fighting over food. So anyway, that compromise and keep coming back at it. And with that family, it was 7 days in a week. Mom cooked one night, dad cooked another, the boy cooked one. They had sandwich night, pizza night, go out to dinner night, and leftover night. And so 7 days of the week, the compromise, mom only had to cook once.
Yeah. And that's the beautiful thing about that. So I think thinking about having those conversations
Yes.
with your teenager or whatever
Right.
about what this is
Yeah.
what I can give to you. No,
Right.
what can you give back? What can we do together?
Right. And
And that
for
was a
those of
beautiful
us
compromise.
those of us who are moms, if you're a wife currently at the same time, I think you can look at in your marriage how you've had to compromise. We have to do that with our kids sometimes too. And
Mhm.
and And we do, like, okay, sometimes this is what I ask my kids, how many questions can I ask about the event? You know, and some nights, they're like, "Oh, ask away." And other nights, I mean, and I have one child who limitless. I can ask anything I want. Another child said, "You get 2 questions.
Yeah.
You get 2. Make them good, because that's all the information I'm giving you." So, it's work. It's trying to figure out how to do that. And I think it's the same thing with the males in our life,
Yeah.
like whether they're grieving or they're just, yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank
I think we're
you.
running out of time,
You
but
are.
I really appreciate our conversation. And again, for all of you listening to the podcast, if you have a topic that you
Yeah.
would like Gwen and I to cover, let us know.
Yeah.
Our next one of these will be in October. I think I already
Mhm.
planned the date.
Yep.
Now, mid-October, I think.
Yep.
And then after that, we'll do one right around
Well,
Thanksgiving. And
can I say something else besides the
Mhm.
topic? I think if there are people listening who we learn from is these people who have out there living this. So when they listen to it, to write into you or email you with some of their ideas, and then maybe we can share them in a future
Mhm.
broadcast, because they're the ones out there hammering this out day in and day out, living it.
That's true. That's true. If
Mhm.
you've got
We
tidbits of
wanna
little bits of
learn from them.
advice.
Yeah,
Mhm.
for sure.
Absolutely.
And the husbands
Absolutely.
too. Teach us how to work with you.
Yes, for
Yeah, and I
sure.
think that's the other piece, is just saying, what can I do for you? And this is what I need. And yep,
Yeah. And it's hard to say what you need, but it is really important.
it is. Yep.
So thank you
Okay.
again, Gwen. Until
Take
next
care.
time.
All right. Bye-bye.